That was fun. I want to preface by saying, in an effort to not make this video 30+ minutes long, since the subject of aiming is so large, I'm going to spread the topics over multiple videos and focus here on showing you techniques to help you improve outside of directly using an external aim trainer. I really didn't want to make your typical how I became an aim god in just 30 days using 𝗀𝗚𝗹 or Kovacs. Instead, I'm going to show you what techniques make good aimers while giving you tips to improve your mechanical skills in this area. What's up my dudes, it's SuitMonkey here and welcome back to episode 3 of the Level Up series. Let's not waste any more time, let's get into it. So what really goes into aiming? It's not as simple as just clicking hands on your screen, because if it were, everyone would have godlike aim by default, which is obviously not the case. And with that said, you need to understand that there's not a single tip that anyone can give you that'll suddenly unlock all of your aiming potential overnight. It's really a process that takes time to develop. And as a side note, even though I'll be referencing mouse aiming quite often because it's what I use personally, the principles I'm going to discuss are more or less the same for controller players. To start, I want to draw your attention to something that every good aimer knows, and it's right here. This height is your character's default position, and keeping your crosshair around this area is basically the equivalent to looking forward with your head straight. Generally, this is the level your crosshair should naturally rest at whenever you're not specifically looking at something on the ground or in the air. Why? Because it's where our enemies' heads and upper bodies live, and it's where we want our shots to go to be effective. It'll change depending on how far or how close your enemies are to you, whether they're on a raised surface or a decline, but generally use upper body head height as your resting position when moving around. This is referred to as having good crosshair placement. You essentially want your crosshair to be already where it needs to be, so there's as little delay as possible before you can start firing your weapon. This concept is especially important when rounding corners and holding angles. Pointing your crosshair where enemies are likely to be essentially means you're always putting yourself in the best position to shoot first and deal the most initial damage during encounters. There's a tendency in FPS games for us to keep our crosshair pointed at the ground while running around. What then happens when we do go to aim is some of us might flick wildly, get tense, start panic spraying, waste our ammo, miss our shots, then have to reload while getting shot at and most likely dying unnecessarily. Your crosshair placement doesn't always need to be perfect, just consciously practice it long enough so it happens naturally whenever you expect a fight to occur. Now, it's all good to have our crosshair placed where enemies are going to be, but what happens when inevitably the enemy isn't where our crosshair is? This is where our ability to acquire our target comes into play. Sure, you can practice your flicks and click timing, but I want to mention another approach that helps as well. Firstly, a good rule for aiming at anything, whether in game or in real life, is to follow the motions of your target and not so much your crosshair. In most cases, it's actually useful to look past your crosshair and use it as more of a reference point to where the center of your screen is, rather than an actual focal point. Whenever you look somewhere in the game world, you should practice smoothly shifting your crosshair toward that direction, such that your weapon is more or less naturally aligned with what your eyes are focused on. I say shift your crosshair, but what I'm really trying to get at is shifting your screen as a whole. Basically, whatever you're looking at should more or less be around the center area of your viewport. In other words, it means try to look around the world with your hands more so than your eyes just darting around while your hands stay still. It's kind of like an extension of crosshair placement, but this technique is called screen centering. It trains you to subconsciously know where the middle of your screen is and trains your hands to naturally follow where your eyes go, and it's something that'll help your hand-eye coordination and your target acquisition. Eventually, whenever you look at something that's not where the center of your screen is, your brain will subconsciously shift your crosshair such that the middle will always point to where your eyes are focused. The goal here is to train your brain to get familiar with where the middle point of your screen is in relation to the different objects that you're looking at, whether it be enemies or anything else. This is to help us increase the accuracy of our reactive aiming. By practicing screen centering, you're naturally building the habit of placing your target as close to the center of your viewport as possible, meaning less action is required to align your gun to your target, because essentially what you're doing is naturally aiming with your screen before you even ADS. Most players have unknowingly experienced moments when they've seen an enemy, ADS'd on them, then realized that the reticle was exactly on target with little to no effort required to aim. This is because the screen was centered on target without them realizing, and it's what we want to happen subconsciously every time we aim at something. And speaking of ADSing, for those of us that aren't sure when we should ADS, basically the only time you shouldn't ADS is if it affects your ability to acquire your target, like situations where you're in super close range and making large rapid movements, or if you yourself need the ability to move or look around quickly. There's a pretty common issue that can develop when we automatically ADS before firing our weapons, because that's how most of us are taught to aim. ADS before you pull your trigger. It becomes a hard habit to break, and we end up doing it even if it handicaps us. Going ADS in most cases sacrifices your movement speed and visibility in return for a tighter bullet spread. This is why a lot of players who reflexively ADS in super close range then find themselves unable to let go of the ADS button and get destroyed because they can no longer acquire or track their target properly. There's another reason your finger gets stuck on the ADS button as well, which I'll explain as part of a bigger topic later in the video, but for now, what helped me to break the habit of auto-ADSing was to literally hip-fire everything within range. ADSing is highly situational and is based on how fast your target's moving, how good your aim is, what gun and what scope you're using. But typically, any targets this close to you are within hip-fire range, and anything else should be ADS'd. You want to get a feel for this range so you subconsciously know where it begins, and to do that, make a mindful effort whenever you engage a target to actively remind yourself to not press the ADS button and just hip fire. After a while of doing this, you should realize you're no longer ADSing out of habit and you'll automatically use the mode that's the most effective for your given scenario based on your visibility, movement, and accuracy, rather than mindlessly clamping down on the ADS button and spraying. Practice being mindful of what your hands are doing before you engage a target, and soon you'll be able to choose when to ADS rather than being stuck in habit. To recap everything so far, good crosshair placement trains you to look and place your crosshair where enemies are likely to be. Good screen centering trains your hands to follow your eyes wherever they look, and knowing when to ADS gives you better control of your weapon during engagements. These concepts work together in unison to help you accurately acquire your target and pretty much bleed over into the next area I'm going to discuss. But before I continue, thanks a bunch for hanging out on the channel. It's small, but we're growing. By the time this video is released, we would have passed the 800 subscriber mark, which is just... you guys are great. You can hit like or leave a comment so I know for sure you want to see more of these types of videos, and also to feed the YouTube machine. If not, you can just sit back and soak up the info. Now, getting back to aiming. Unless we're using guns that kill in a single hit against opponents that are standing still, we're most likely going to have to track our enemies while simultaneously shooting at them. Tracking fire is probably going to be the most common engagement scenario you find yourself in, especially in Apex, where the majority of the weapons are automatic. Like I mentioned before, screen centering helps to train your hands to follow where your eyes are focused on, and thus aids in your ability to track your opponent's motions while firing your weapon. But I bring up tracking to more highlight an issue that really affects players' abilities to keep their crosshairs on moving targets, and that is when they start firing at someone, proceed to strafe, and then don't correct for their own movement, making all their shots miss unnecessarily. As we know, movement is the other key factor in Apex, and if you're going to combine movement while aiming, you'll have to practice and understand counter-aiming. By the way, I'll link the last episode up top, which covers how to pull off techniques like wall jumping, bunny hopping, zigzagging, etc. Now, your ability to counter-aim can also be thought of as your effective aim, since more often than not, you'll have to aim while either you or your opponent is in motion, rather than only being required to hit stationary targets. Aim assist on controllers can help mitigate a portion of the inaccuracies associated with poor counter-aiming, but it's not enough to protect you from someone who could subconsciously counter-aim during any movement they're performing. Using the dummy as an example, if I stand still and start firing, the shots hit consistently. However, standing completely still during a gunfight isn't always possible, and the moment I begin strafing without accounting for my movement, you see how wildly my shots miss. It may sound pretty obvious, but strafing isn't something you want to do mindlessly. Rather, it should happen reactively to what's happening during the fight, if at all, and in conjunction with what your mouse is doing. Yet, so many of us automatically move around in an uncontrolled manner without realizing it. What I'm really saying here is yes, you don't want to be a sitting duck while shooting, but you also don't want to make the job of hitting your opponent any more difficult than it needs to be by introducing unnecessary factors into the equation. Using the moving target as an example, if it's going the same direction I'm strafing, I no longer need to aim to keep track of it, because in Apex, movement speeds are more or less the same, except when you're ADS with certain weapons. This is an example of what's called mirror strafing, which is when you're mimicking your target's strafing pattern and the only thing your aim hand will be doing at this point is controlling for recoil. The other, more common type of strafing is usually out of sync between parties, and this is where understanding counter-aiming pays off. You're going to find yourself in many situations where either you or your opponent are moving entirely in one direction, moving back and forth, or barely moving at all. This is not something we can think about during battle, so we need to practice it so it becomes intuitive and subconscious. Before sessions, spend at least 10 minutes in the firing range, actively moving around while keeping your crosshair on a target dummy. You don't necessarily need to shoot, but you can if you want. Just aim to keep your crosshair on target at all times. Do long strafes, short strafes, circle strafes, and mix them up. Throw a hollow spray on the ground and challenge yourself to move around while keeping your crosshair on the base. Do the same thing with the moving targets in the back. And remember, when doing all this, relax, focus on your target, and let your brain handle the crosshair. What this will ultimately accomplish is training your brain to understand the motions necessary to counter-aim while moving. And of course, you'll also be actively doing this during your regular gameplay as well. It's best to isolate the concept of counter-aiming so your brain understands it and thus learns how to apply it in any given situation. This is going to go hand in hand with an aspect of gameplay that players underestimate the importance of when it comes to having good aim: near perfect recoil control. I'm just going to put it like this: it's not enough to simply know what each weapon spray pattern looks like. You should have the ability to more or less one-clip an opponent that's standing still with zero attachments on your gun. In a game like Apex with loot RNG, you need to be proficient with your weapon in any attachment state. Learning recoil control is kind of like a catch-all in that the more patterns you ingrain into your muscle memory, the easier it is to generally control other guns. Some people tend to think their muscle memory is limited to a small number of patterns, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Your brain stores thousands of tasks that you don't even realize and can adapt on the fly based on the information it's receiving. This is why, technically, changing your sensitivity won't ruin your muscle memory, but more on that later. You can and should know how to control the recoil patterns for most guns in the game if you're serious about getting better, and the best part of it is simply a matter of repetition. You're not going to master each pattern overnight, but the goal is to fire the weapons you want to get good at deliberately and often, so controlling it becomes an automatic reflex you don't even notice. Pick the gun or guns you want to master and run them as often as you can in-game for a 2-week period, and couple this with 10 minutes in the firing range while clipping dummies over and over again before sessions. First, shoot the dummy in front of you standing at one end, and once you can one-clip that one, try to one-clip the one next to it until you can move over to the farthest dummy. You don't have to one-clip the last one, but it's a good gauge of how accurate your recoil control is at distance. It doesn't matter if you miss, just relax and keep shooting. Like any other skill, it'll take time. Try not to focus too much on controlling the recoil for X gun, because then you'll be focused too much on the wrong task. Rather, just relax and focus on hitting your target. Let your brain handle the corrections. Next, I need to make a point about choosing the correct sensitivity because it will affect your recoil control, tracking, and accuracy if it's unsuitable. The entire point of adjusting your sense is to find a setting that makes you unhindered. That is, your ability to be precise isn't held back and your ability to keep up with movement is unimpeded, meaning you have enough granularity to be precise, and also your ability to look left, right, and do a comfortable 180 is retained. You've probably heard this 1,000 times, but typically this means lowering your sense is beneficial in most cases. Changing your sense will only allow you to get better if it's the reason you're being held back, so you need to experiment and be honest with yourself. I'll throw up a graph I made using Apex player data from prosettings.net. The data isn't 100% accurate since entries must be manually adjusted, but it gives a pretty good idea where pro sensitivities tend to cluster. Generally for Apex, when normalized to 800 dpi, most fall within the 1 to 2 in-game sensitivity range, with 1.5 being the most used. Of course, outliers exist. Personally, I started with what I consider a high sensitivity of 2.5 in game at 800 dpi, and even though looking around felt quick and easy, after a couple of months I realized my recoil control, ability to track targets, and shot accuracy was extremely inconsistent from session to session. Through experimentation, lowering my sense and raising it again, giving myself a few days or weeks to adjust to settings ranging from 2.5 all the way down to 1.0, now I play comfortably at 1.5 in game with the same DPI of 800, and it's where I've seen the most consistency and progress. At 400 DPI, this number translates to 3.0, and at 1600, 0.75. For you, it might be the same, higher, or lower, but it just so happens to be where my shots, recoil control, and movement are consistent. Don't be afraid to change your sense because you feel it will ruin your hard-earned muscle memory. Like I mentioned before, your muscle memory isn't that limited. Riding a bicycle of a different style doesn't mean you suddenly forget how to ride a bike. It might feel different at first, but you'll quickly adjust since you already know how to ride, and you could end up being a better rider overall with the new one. When it comes to changing your sense, the same principle applies. Note that if you're currently playing with a high sense, you can't realistically expect to make a large change and suddenly take full advantage of it. It'll take time to adjust because your brain will have to learn to use different parts of your arm to aim, so do it in stages and stick with a particular setting for a while. Now, with all that said, there's one final thing that'll ruin your recoil control, mess up your ADSing, destroy your aim, and negate everything I've mentioned so far, and is probably one of the main reasons for not being able to aim properly, and that is tension. A massive key to everything I've said so far, especially tracking enemies and consistently controlling recoil, is the ability to stay calm, especially under pressure. One of the biggest problems I've faced when it came to improving my aim was the ability to stay relaxed. Tension is your #1 enemy when it comes to pretty much any mechanical ability that requires fine motor skills like playing an instrument or aiming. The two major problems caused are 1. Artificial recoil, and 2. Loss of precision. When we tense up, whether it be due to us being scared to lose the fight, getting startled, or constantly missing our shots, our muscles contract, our heart rate rises, and our precision drops, with our only objective being to survive. Ever see someone fumbling with keys to open a door while running from a killer? It's exactly the same thing, and it happens on a micro scale as well. You will lose your fine motor skills and the ability to aim properly when tension is allowed to rise. When this is happening, breathe slowly and take deep breaths. Make a purposeful effort to calm down and avoid tilting. Doing this while also building confidence in your mechanical abilities through practice will help you overcome this tension. Personally, when I started playing Apex, I was dead scared to get into fights, which made me always tense up even as my skills began to increase. And it was only after consistently taking fights, being warmed up and confident in my abilities, actively staying calm and learning from my mistakes that I saw real progress. Remember, being relaxed makes you smooth, being smooth makes you accurate, and being accurate makes you fast. No one starts out with good aim, and some people develop faster than others. Remember, your only competition is yourself, and not other players who have completely different circumstances. So long as you can look back a couple of months to a year at your past self and see how bad you were compared to now, that is the mark of progress. You'll hit a point of slowed progress inevitably, but this is completely normal. This is where perseverance and the will to get better separates the pros from the casuals. It's a matter of practice, finding what works and changing what doesn't. So to recap, practice crosshair placement, practice screen centering, know when to ADS, practice counter aiming, understand recoil control, pick the right sensitivity, and finally, remove tension. I really hope this vid helped you guys out. This video was just a general overview of good aiming techniques, and I plan to go more in depth into topics like strafing and tracking in future videos. Enjoy the process of improving your aim, my dudes, and that's it for episode 3. You guys take care, and SuitMonkey out. Oh, whoa, smart. Oh, she got a PK. Oh no, she's whiffing. Alright.
Yeah.
You are the Apex champions.